One choice, one decision can change the whole direction of our lives. Albert Camus said, life is a sum of all your choices. Stephen Covey, the management guru, said, I'm not a product of my circumstances, I'm a product of my decisions. J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books, wrote that it is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. It's our choices that show what we truly are. So on this first Sunday in Advent, we remember that the whole Christmas story really begins with two key choices by two key role players. On the one hand, Joseph decides not to divorce Mary, and that allows certain things to happen. And Mary says yes to the bearing of the Son of God, and that opens up the whole story, as we know. Just two key choices changes the whole story of the world. An experiment was done to show what a neurologist calls brain shift. The argument is, in fact, the evidence is that under certain conditions, our brains see the world differently. So a whole lot of experiments have been done around it, but here's one of them. In the newsroom of a newspaper, there were some regular staff members who were warned, who were told what would happen and how they should respond to that. They then brought in a group of people, the ones that they were doing the experiment on, as it were, and these people wanted to be journalists. They were looking for a permanent position in a newsroom. So once the experiment started, after a little while, the room began to fill with smoke. And those who designed the experiment made it look exactly as if the building was on fire. That would be the logical conclusion by all the smoke. But none of the regular staff members moved. They had been warned, they had been asked to stay where they were. So none of them moved. They carried on as if all was well. But 90% of that test group, those people who were hoping for jobs as journalists, they didn't move. It looked like the building was on fire, but they didn't move. Only 10% got up to escape the burning building. And the scientists say that this is more than just peer pressure. This is more than what they sometimes call group think. They say that when the brain is confronted with high anxiety or the possibility of a significant reward, our brain does this shift. We have this altered way of seeing the world. We see things differently. And so what is quite obviously foolish or wrong to those on the outside will seem to us in that moment to be perfectly right, perfectly logical. And so you would find intelligent people just carrying on working in a building which might well be on fire. On the one hand, it seems impossible, but when you think about it, think of the news stories we hear so often. I mean, doesn't it amaze you, it amazes me, that a man would go and recruit some guys to help him kill his wife, when the last guy who did the very same thing is sitting in jail? Doesn't common sense tell you that this is a bad idea, not just morally, but this is a bad idea in many ways, in so many ways, and maybe you need another plan? Or what makes a carer in a retirement village, someone who's given their life, their income, their well-being into caring for the elderly? And what makes that person allow thugs, murderers, to come in and kill and steal from old people? What's going on in a mind that does that? What turns suburban mom and dads, suburban grannies and grandpas into white-collar thieves? Why do people have affairs when it's universally known that eventually the truth somehow creeps out somewhere? How is it that so many of us go through our lives making so many bad choices, some of them small, but many of them life-changing? Why do we do it? Is there anything we can do about it? I think one of the most famous bad choice stories in the scriptures is that famous story, we call it the story of the prodigal son, the story of the prodigal son. And so from Luke 15, I read, to illustrate the point further, Jesus had told two other stories. Jesus told them this story. A man had two sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now, before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I'll go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. And his son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For the son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So the party began. That whole story begins with a decision, with a choice. Now let me be clear, just so we're not being silly about this. The real point of that extraordinary parable is really about how incredibly good and kind God is. But the way Jesus tells the story, his method of telling the story, is he wants us to recognize that in everything in the story, it all depends on various decisions that we make. It's the decision to ask for the inheritance. It's the decision to leave home. It's the decision to squander the money. It's the decision to go and feed the pigs. And eventually it's the decision to come home. It's all about the choices the prodigal son is making. So let's see what there is for us here. What can we learn from this to help us in our own choices, bad or otherwise? Well, one of the key reasons that people make bad decisions, make bad choices, is we just don't look down the road far enough. We don't look down the road far enough. Many bad decisions are made because people haven't considered properly the potential consequences of those decisions, of those choices. We often will make impulsive and relatively unconsidered decisions. And as we mentioned earlier, the promise of a reward can distort how we see our world. Whether that reward will be financial, emotional, sexual, or some kind of status, it's really quite common for people to not play out properly what might happen, to consider how it will go. And I think that's what the prodigal did. In verse 12, you'll remember the younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now, before you die. The fancy people would say that the prodigal lacked second order thinking. He never considered the downside of this decision. He never considered what it might do to his relationships. He never put any good financial plans in place. All he wanted was the money now. And every decision we make, every choice we make, sets us on a particular path with a whole world of consequences and possibilities. And so the significant decisions we make really deserve a little bit of thought. And so second order thinking, to use that phrase, is the work we do to choose as wisely as we are able to with the information that we have before us. No one can predict how it all will absolutely work out. But we can take reasonable care in our decisions. One psychologist recommends that before you make a big decision, you should ask yourself quite seriously, what's the worst that could happen? The psychologist recommends that's the good question. What's the worst that could happen? And to try and answer that question honestly, and when you get that answer, use that information in making your decision. If the men who had plotted to kill their wives had asked themselves that question, and if they'd asked it sincerely and seriously, they may well not be in jail now or on trial for killing their wives. If they'd said, what's the worst that could happen, and they'd considered it, perhaps a wiser person would not have made that choice. Jesus says in Luke 14, speaking about following him, the cost of discipleship, he says, who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there is enough money to finish it? Second order thinking. Look down the road. The second thing I want to say today is rethink bad decisions as soon as you're able to. Rethink bad decisions as soon as you can. Just as the prodigal's money runs out after he's done some seriously wild living, there's kind of this perfect storm and a famine hits the land and he ends up hungry, starving. But instead at that moment of kind of going, I've messed up, I'm going to go home, the prodigal goes and gets a job. I suppose he wants to try and stay independent. He wants to kind of go, I've made an okay decision, I'll make this right. But then we're told the young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. But no one gave him anything. Even pig food looked good to him, and the circumstances were only getting worse, not better. And again, psychologists tell us that sometimes we can be so proud, it's about our ego. Sometimes we can be so proud that it's hard to admit that we've made a mistake. It's hard to admit that we've chosen badly. So we keep trying to justify our decisions. Instead of getting out, instead of turning around, we just dig deeper. We eat pig food. And apparently this is one of the most common features of bad choices. People who are simply too proud to admit their mistakes and to turn around. Apparently it's a common, huge thing. That's one of the reasons we dig ourselves deeper and deeper. We're just too proud. And I think we actually saw quite a lot of this during COVID. I don't know if you agree with it. No one in our home are smokers. No one in our family are smokers, so I don't have a horse in this race. But I think our government behaved badly in the banning of cigarettes. The government refused to understand that a smoker's going to smoke. They're going to find their ciggies somewhere, you know. All the government did was make it good for the illicit trade of cigarettes. And so when they noticed that behavior, we saw that instead of lifting the ban or instead of amending the ban to fit what was really going on in the country, they just dug deeper. They just kept repeating it. Too proud to admit that maybe that isn't the best way to do things. So to be clear, sometimes it is heroic. Sometimes you need real leadership to push through difficult times, to guide people through things that need to happen. Sometimes that's the case. But there are many times in which the real wisdom in life, the real strength in life, is found in admitting your bad decision and then working to make it right. So rethink a bad decision as soon as you can. And then finally, let me say, avoid making decisions when you are tired, hungry, or, if we can use this phrase, emotionally charged. Avoid making decisions when you're tired, hungry, or emotionally charged. In the prodigal son story we read, the young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. So it gives us a hint of his physical state. When we are tired, hungry, or emotionally charged, and when I say emotionally charged, I mean we could be angry, we could be a bit manic, I mean like over the top is what I mean, we could even be drunk, inebriated. And we know that we can make bad decisions, and some of those decisions can in fact have lifelong consequences just in a moment. And I remember the devastation of an abortion for a young woman who after just one ill-considered night was left with a lifelong consequence. And this was not how she knew herself. She never imagined that the word abortion would live with her for the rest of her days. Just one night, one decision had changed her life. So we need to be very careful not only how we make decisions, but we need to be careful when we make decisions. Our emotional state is very important when making decisions. Whether the decision is about a conversation we want to have, an email we need to write, a text message, some action we want to take, or even a reaction we have to something, consider not just how we make our decisions, but when we make them. If the moment feels too intense in any way, try not to say or do anything in that moment that you might regret. Slow down. I still think sleeping on things is a wise principle when we are under pressure, when things are intense and we need to make a key decision or response. So, as we start bringing things to a close, the literal turning point in the story of the prodigal son is verse 17. We read, when he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. This is what we want, as far as is possible. When making decisions, when making our choices, we want to come to our senses. We want to be sure we're in our right mind. We want to be sensible as best as we are able when making decisions. And so my last observation is, do your best to make sure you are. One final little epilogue. Verse 20. He returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, and filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. The wonderful, wonderful promise of the gospel is that even our worst choices, even our very worst choices, are met with the searching, loving gaze of the Father, who welcomes us home with compassion, with a hug, and with the kiss of belonging. Even our very worst choices, we are welcomed home. So can I say to you, whatever foolish choices you've made in the past, I pray deeply, I really do, I pray deeply that this Advent season will be for you a coming home. And God bless you.